partly the idea of constructing the seminar series as a series of conversation was linked to look at the way that you had phrased and organized the work, and thinking about this idea of the dialogue, but also the contestation as a dialogical dimension in the intellectual exploration. So the theme of today's conversation is thinking decoloniality through an intersectional lens. We have Professor Brah giving a talk, drawing on her work and on the recent published book. And then we have the pleasure to have Dr. Nirmal Puwar from Goldsmith College to provide some reflection and ideas and discussing the presentation, and Dr. Angelo Martin Jr. from IRIS, as you heard, also engaging with the thinking around the politics of difference and differentiation. So, Avtar, the floor is yours. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nando. And so it's actually quite a pleasure to be here. First of all, I want to begin by thanking Angelo Martins Jr. for inviting me to be here. It's a special pleasure because Nirmal is going to be also part of the conversation. So that's very, we've been working together for many, many years, so that's a special pleasure. Now, I will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then, Nirmal will speak, and then we'll have a conversation, all of us. So I've been working in the academy for some considerable time, and I keep hoping that things are changing for the better. I hope to hear from everyone today as to how much we have achieved, how far we have come. I have worked at 3 universities in Britain: Leicester University, the Open University, and Birkbeck College, University of London. For a period at Birkbeck, I worked in the Department of Continuing Education, and in my then capacity of lecturer in multicultural education, I helped develop diploma and extramural courses, some of which were taught by academic staff who came from outside Birkbeck. The course topics included a study of different varieties of racism, ranging from anti-black, anti-Asian, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, and anti-Irish racisms. So we need to talk about racisms in the plural. What was the specificity of color in these different racisms, we asked. We examined socioeconomic, political, and cultural dimensions of racism in the curriculum, in staff recruitment, support and progression, and of course in everyday life. Apart from racism, we also explored themes related to gender, class, ability, disability, and sexuality. Our primary aim was to dismantle structures of intersectional inequities and inequalities in the higher education sector, and to help foster politics of equality, diversity, and inclusion. Subsequently, I developed a postgraduate level program in race and ethnicity which addressed structural and cultural facets of our life worlds. More recently, I've shifted my attention to questions of coloniality and decoloniality. In my recent book, Decolonial Imaginings, that's the book, Intersectional Conversations and Contestations, as the title implies, I've explored processes and political genealogies of coloniality and decoloniality and their manifestations and legacies in our present-day social and psychic landscape. This work emerges out of my intellectual concerns and pursuits and political activism surrounding effects and differential impact of the intersections between gender, class, ethnicity, and sexuality on our lives. It attempts to deploy analytical frameworks that foreground the interweaving of issues of borders, boundaries, relationalities, antagonisms, but importantly also interconnections. Questions of solidarities within and across difference are at the heart of the text. I place a particular emphasis on what the socialist feminist-oriented Kombahi River Collective asserted way back in 1977. And I quote, We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic system of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that the work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the profit of bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources. End of quote. Furthermore, the collective argues that a socialist revolution is inadequate on its own, and it must be accompanied by a feminist and anti-racist revolution. This vision, combining as it does egalitarian principles with an emphasis on the maintenance of material equality, remains as intensely relevant today as it was then. My book has been written during the seismic impact of the pandemic COVID-19, when, in August of this year, nearly 7 million deaths were reported globally. We have witnessed global lockdowns when whole populations have had to go into self-isolation. In Britain, and perhaps this is not confined to Britain, people in deprived areas have experienced a death rate that is twice that of those living in more affluent areas. There have been disproportionate deaths among men, older people, frontline workers, and black and minoritized ethnic groups. The reasons for these disparities are complex. In the case of black and minoritized ethnic groups, for instance, socio-economic disadvantage and the effects of racism would seem to be among the key factors at work. Black and minoritized ethnic groups in Britain are more likely to work in high-risk frontline jobs, and they tend to live in deprived, crowded areas, and some reside in multi-generational households with limited space. In other words, this is a story about social inequality. In all this, one figure that has emerged as being especially demonized in both popular and critical discourses has been that of the migrant. This figure has been associated with negative connotations. The imagery encoded in these representations constructs the migrant as threatening, as an object of fear. We have witnessed a clamor for the introduction of harsh policies to keep the numbers of migrants down. These policies have included the notorious hostile environment measures designed to either deport migrants or put pressure on them to leave voluntarily. There is a long history in Britain of hostility towards migrants from non-European countries, even when they were needed for economic reasons. But more recently, even European migrants, especially from Eastern Europe, came to be viewed as problematic and threatening. The political climate created by the noxious discourse of hostile environment deeply impacted the lives of a variety of groups, including refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, as well as racialized settled communities. The life chances of these categories of people and their socio-economic, cultural, and political predicaments form a central part of the story of contemporary Britain. Increasingly, scholars are drawing attention to the importance of coloniality, decoloniality in the modern world, especially in relation to epistemic genealogies. In these, as scholars such as Stuart Hall have argued, coloniality is constitutive of modernity. Here, a focus on knowledge regimes is complemented by analysis of economic and political dimensions. The term decolonization was transformed into decoloniality towards the end of the Cold War, with the aim in large part to foreground decolonization of knowledge. So the emphasis shifted on knowledge, so as to critique, challenge, and dismantle colonial epistemic hierarchies. I have detected a pronounced tendency in decolonial thought to claim that previous analysis of colonialism was likely to overemphasize the study of economic and political consequences of colonialism rather than that of knowledge practice. that was actually the claim, that we tended actually to emphasize too much on the economic consequences and political consequences and not enough on knowledge. My position is that the veracity of this claim is debatable, since a number of theorists such as Gayatri Spivak and John Mackenzie long ago addressed questions of knowledge production within the colonial context. What is more important, I would suggest, is that an effective political strategy must always include analysis of epistemic as well as socioeconomic, cultural, and political differentiations and cleavages. It is important to recognize that the discourse of decoloniality has emerged in parallel with the discourse of post-coloniality, though the two are distinct developments. The concept of post-coloniality is associated primarily with the experience of British colonialism, whereas the notion of decoloniality is likely to be applied more to the experience of South America, the Caribbean, and Latino populations in the USA. One could view these twin concepts as marking complementary projects with similar goals of transformation. Stuart Hall has been one of the key figures to theorize the post-colonial, referring to transnational and transcultural global processes that are seen as a departure from narratives of the nation. So the focus on globality as compared to the nation. On the other hand, Walter Mignolo has been a major proponent of the concept of decoloniality, emphasizing its relationship to modernity, its interrogation of the rhetoric of development and modernization, as well as posing a challenge to the analytical apparatus of Marxist materialism. In other words, while they are common to both projects, the legacies of colonialism are addressed differently. Although formally and directly colonized societies may no longer be as common today as they once were, but they're far from absent. Present-day British colonies include Anguilla, Bermuda, Falkland Islands, and Gibraltar. The point is that coloniality as an ideology and discursive formation with real material effects and impact is still very much around. So how do we think about decoloniality? How do we differentiate between decolonization and decoloniality? How do we explore the present-day consequences of colonization and decolonization? Generally speaking, the term decolonization, as distinct from decoloniality, refers to the processes, events, and histories of political challenge and resistance mounted by colonized peoples, which led to the declaration of political independence of the colonies. For instance, India, the country of my birth, gained political independence in 1947, whereas Uganda, the country where I grew up, did not achieve independence until 1962. As noted above, there are countries which still exist in a colonial relationship with Britain. So this is not just history, it's present as well. It is important to bear in mind that colonialism is a socio-economic, political, and cultural mode of exploitation and oppression, which deeply marks the subjectivities, the very interiority of the minds and identities of both colonized and the colonizer. So impacts on both sides of the equation, albeit differently through a hierarchical relationship. If decolonization, as noted above, is primarily a socioeconomic, political, and cultural project, the concept of decoloniality foregrounds knowledge regimes that underpin those processes. The point to emphasize here is that knowledge is very much part and parcel of forces of appropriation. Decoloniality invites us to prioritize regimes of knowledge that have been sidelined, ignored, forgotten, or repressed by the forces of modernity, colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. I have explored the concept of decoloniality and post-coloniality in some detail because they centrally inform my analysis, especially in terms of feminist decoloniality, which offers a gendered reading of capitalist modernity. Decolonial feminist politics interrogate, challenge, and finally aim to erase the colonial difference embedded in the notion of coloniality of power. The concept of coloniality of power highlights the inseparability of racialization and capitalist exploitation. Formal colonialism may be over, as I said, but the power relations derived from colonialism are an important feature of our contemporary world. An example of organizational encoding of decolonial politicization may be seen to be provided by the project of politically black feminism in Britain, which has been at the forefront of enacting decolonial politics. It emerged as a feminist coalition amongst women of African, Caribbean, and South Asian heritage. I was part of the development of this movement, initially in Bristol, but more substantially in London. We challenged such institutions as the immigration legal system, modes of oppressive policing, and other policies of the state that had a negative impact on racialized communities. Today, it is likely that the term black is reserved for those with the black African heritage, and the term people of color is deployed to cover other groups with ancestry in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, as well as indigenous groups. It is important to analyze the history of this political formation, people of color, in the context of its colonial and imperial genealogies, as well as local and global mobilities and migrations. British black feminism and other feminisms of color contested those aspects of white feminism which inscribed racialized dimensions and outcomes. So it's not white in the sense of, oh, here are white women, here are black women, but actually it is very much about, a formation which is racialized. So it says something about racism. Here it is critical to bring into the orbit of our discussion the concept of politics of location, which was developed by feminists such as Adrienne Rich and Chandra Mohanty. This term, politics of location, addresses the ways in which axes of differentiation such as gender, race, and class are theorized as intersecting modalities in which we are all differently positioned. Today, we are likely to use the concept of intersectionality most closely, though not exclusively associated with Kimberly Crenshaw, to name these phenomena and tackle the complex relationships between different axes of differentiation, such as class and gender, as they intertwine and impact our body, mind, and psyche. Questions of coloniality and decoloniality raise the issue of how to think about borders and boundaries. The theme of migration, movement, and mobilities need to be situated in relation to borders and boundaries, where borders and boundaries are conceptualized not simply as territorial, but also as social, cultural, political, socioeconomic, and psychological. Borders facilitate crossings for some groups of people and hinder them for others. Border crossing may become highly politicized events, and international politics are thoroughly enmeshed in the governance of borders. Following Etienne Balibar, I'm interested in what borders actually do as specific historical conjunctures. Questions of ethnicity, nationalism, national identity, and belonging are central to thinking about borders. Ethnicity is about the fact or a state of belonging to a social group which holds national or cultural traditions in common. For instance, I have a Punjabi background, and I share this ethnicity with other Punjabis, though some Punjabis may have Islamic background, and yet others may be Hindus or Sikhs. The term Punjabi signifies a historical connection with the state of Punjab, which was divided in 1947 between India and the then newly created country of Pakistan. At the heart of Punjabi ethnicity is the common language Punjabi, spoken by people with this heritage. So I'm giving that as an example, really, to highlight, how identities are created and constructed through questions of language and ethnicity. It is worth pointing out that ethnicity is not fixed, but variable and contextual. That's very important. And even as it is underpinned by shared cultural traditions. Like ethnicity, the concept of nation is variable in meaning. Nations may be understood in terms of claim to territory, questions of citizenship, and issues of legal political rights. Moreover, nations are imagined communities, that is, communities imagined as having common descent, kinship ties, and cultural traditions. Equally, national identity underpins and delineates the subjective feelings one shares with a group of people about a nation, regardless of one's legal citizenship status. But what about nationalism? What is the relationship between nation and nationalism? In this regard, it is widely understood that nationalism is underlined by identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. In other words, nationalism is an ideology that emphasizes loyalty, devotion, or allegiance to a nation or nation-state, and holds that such obligations outweigh other individual or group interests. It can have both positive and negative associations and effects. On the positive side, it is the case that many countries gained their political independence from the colonized by waging nationalist struggles, many. On the other hand, nationalism may include xenophobia, intolerance, isolationism, as well as enforcement of anti-immigrant policies. In short, my argument is that it is critically important to examine the ways in which these concepts and the interrelation between them is theorized, understood, and acted upon. So both theorization is important, but also action is important. I try to make the case for a non-essentialist conception of these categories. Histories are littered with the multifarious ways in which interconnections as well as cleavages between social groups are produced, struggled over, and contested. Analysis of immigration law are instructive in helping us think through borders and boundaries of them and us. How, for instance, the working of immigration control are marked by the play of anti-migrant popular and state rhetoric and practice, which are thoroughly exploited by the political right. In this context, there is the need to look into how we may produce bonds of commonality, connectivity, and conviviality as ways of doing social divisions marked by borders. I would suggest that we formulate a notion of a non-essentialist universalism, or what we may call pluriversalism, following Walter Mignola. To think about borders reminds us of ways in which diasporas are created. In today's world, migration and mobility has become commonplace, even as much of the world's population is not necessarily on the move. These mobilities vary in type. For instance, some are a result of forced migration, such as flows of refugees and asylum seekers, while others are voluntary, such as movement of people in search of better opportunities and life chances, though of course forces of economic necessity might problematize the degree to which labeling a specific movement voluntary is an appropriate designation or not. A linked question relates to how we might conceptualize diasporas. This is both a theoretical and empirically necessary question. Empirically, we have a wide range of diasporas scattered around the globe. We may focus on a single diasporic group or compare and contrast two or more diasporas. Theoretically, the issue is one in which questions of conceptual elaboration become paramount as we formulate analytical framework to analyze a social problem. In my own work, I have theorized diaspora along four axes of differentiation. namely diaspora understood as a social relation, as experience, as subjectivity, and as identity. Each of these terms in turn may be subjected to theoretical scrutiny. How do we theorize subjectivity, for instance? Through a psychoanalytic conceptual repertoire or within a sociological lens? My concept of diaspora space has become established as an important construct in feminist studies and diaspora studies and is widely used. Yet whilst there is a large body of literature on diasporas, there is limited material that addresses the field of diaspora studies and feminism together. My attempt to tackle the subject is one of the first to foreground the articulation of gender and diaspora. I analyze diaspora as a historically specific genealogy in the Foucauldian sense, and diaspora space as an articulation of diaspora, border, and politics of location. The emerging field of queer diasporas constituted an important and new development. Studies in this arena challenge nationalist ideologies by highlighting diaspora as a space of the impure, inauthentic, and non-essentialist. Hence, there is an undermining of conceptions of a world of pure and authentic domains of essentialism. Whilst there is a very significant body of literature that treats the subject diaspora and intersectionality separately, I try to bring these two fields together. The point is that diasporas are inherently intersectional, and that the study of diasporas and intersectionality is closely related. The interrelationship between diaspora and intersectionality has a common focus on and through difference, foregrounding both conceptual and embodied connection. Decolonial imaginings are, to some considerable extent, about the politics of alterity and alliance. In other words, coalition politics are central to imagining decolonial futures. Decolonial politics are centrally concerned with questions of equality, rights, and justice. They underline the importance of dialogue across differences of gender, class, ethnicity, and how we might be differently racialized depending, for instance, on our color. Decolonial politics are essentially about solidarity and alliance forged through shared agendas. They foreground how both individually and collectively we develop a politics of working together, a politics of solidarity. One of the key themes underlying the project of mounting decolonial politics involves mobilizing the concept of cosmopolitanism, which foregrounds a world governed by overarching principles of rights and justice, which celebrates cultural diversity, multiplicity, fluidity, and hybridity. Gerald de Lanty identifies 4 dimensions of cosmopolitanism as follows. Firstly, cosmopolitanism understood as a political philosophy marked by normative principles associated with world citizenship and a global governance. Secondly, as a signifier of liberal multiculturalism, with its focus on plurality and an embracing of difference. Thirdly, as a transnational formation highlighting cosmopolitan underpinnings of transnational processes. And fourthly, as a methodological approach. Cosmopolitan's penchant to prioritize dialogue and debate across difference inscribes the sensibility of living together. This aspect has proved attractive to those who favor world citizenship, though the notion of world citizenship may itself remain disembedded. Instead, I would propose that the idea of cosmopolitan citizenship may be more appropriate, in that a concept of cosmopolitan citizenship draws attention not only to legal status, but also to public participation in civil society. Scholars and political activists such as Sylvia Wynter, Angela Davis, Chandra Talpade Mohanty, and many others draw our attention to the ways in which we might reconfigure the concept of the human. How might we rethink the concept of the human? In such ways that humanness comes to be seen as a verb. I think this is very important. humanness comes to be seen as a verb rather than simply a noun, thereby underlining and emphasizing political practice and praxis. The concept of cosmopolitan, which we have addressed above, becomes useful to reiterate here. A cosmopolitan imagination helps illuminate local and global connections, and a cosmopolitan sensibility enhances the capacity for care and obligation to others. It foregrounds the importance of simultaneously upholding the principle of diversity as well as that of shared public culture. Boaventura de Sousa Santos advocates what he calls an ethos of insurgent cosmopolitanism. I like that. Or a counter-hegemonic globalization from below, consisting of transnationally organized resistance. Insurgent cosmopolitanism underscores the importance of intercultural translation. That is, we may develop politics as a resource for struggle in the service of social justice. I'm partial to the politics of insurgent cosmopolitanism, but it is often assumed that cosmopolitanism is something that is only available to the elite, who have the resources to travel, be exposed to other cultures, become multilingual, and develop global visions of the common good. Whilst this might historically have been the case, it does not quite match reality today, when travel is not confined to the elite, nor indeed is exposure to other cultures and lifestyles in our globalized world limited to them alone. In fact, exposure to media in a variety of forms, including print, electronic, and digital, is available to significantly wide sections of the population. Moreover, it is arguable that there can be subaltern forms of cosmopolitanism as well. That's what I'm arguing. These are important to acknowledge, emphasize, and foreground. But it remains the case that the social conditions underlying subaltern, middle class, or elite cosmopolitans are far from being the same. In other words, it is important to highlight the fact that the rhetoric of cosmopolitans may mask deep global inequalities, which we must bear in mind. However, despite this recognition of the prevalence of inequality, there is much that is affirmative about cosmopolitan imaginaries. There are many examples of the project of cosmopolitan available to us. For instance, ethnic and cultural diversity may be common today in diverse settings, including schools, neighborhoods, clubs, and other arenas where people socialize. And we may describe this dimension as everyday cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is more likely to be counterposed to particularity, but I'm suggesting that the two are interconnected. The cosmopolitan ideal can easily coexist with specific attachments and commitments. Indeed, this is often the case. We have our own commitments and attachments to particular social and political programs, but these are not to the exclusion of also having wider visions of cosmopolitan nature. Specificity and generality are closely connected themes rather than separate. They are distinctive, but not always mutually exclusive. I wish to endorse the need for seeking radical transformation of the socio-economic, political, and cultural relations associated with the policies, practices, and various formations of capitalism, imperialism, racism, ableism, heteronormativity, and patriarchal social relations. These are essential if we are to envision positive futures underpinned by equality and justice. As we know, we are all positioned across multiple axes of differentiation along factors such as those of class, gender, or race. Such inter- or cross-sectional embodiment means that we are counterposed in relation to multiple others within and across intersecting modalities of power. A cosmopolitan imagination helps eliminate local and global connection, and a cosmopolitan sensibility enhances the capacity for care and obligation to others. It emphasizes the importance of simultaneously upholding principles of diversity as well as that of shared public culture, thereby underlining feminist politics of interculturality. At the heart of decolonial feminism is a commitment to politics of equality and justice. Following Delanty, I would concur with the idea of a cosmopolitan multiculturalism beyond liberal multiculturalism. This draws attention to the need for addressing the key issue facing intercultural societies, namely to identify ways in which we can both be equal and different at the same time. The concept and associated practices of cosmopolitan multiculturalism are attractive because they are not simply about the plurality of cultures, but also about the recognition of difference against the backdrop of an alternative, just political order. In a related, though somewhat different vein, Boaventura de Sousa Santos has already noted, as I've already noted, also as advocates what he calls insurgent cosmopolitans, that underscores the importance of intercultural translation and communication. Together, these various dimensions of cosmopolitanism to the foreground draw attention to and point us in the direction of the necessity for constructive, wide-ranging political astute agendas. The creation of such agendas need to be undertaken collectively, such that we produce interrelationalities and interconnections which underline a politics of solidarity across difference. Thank you.
Well, I want to start off by saying it's really wonderful to be at this occasion whereby you're not only engaging with the work of Avtar Brah, but also with Stuart Hall's archive. And I love it how Pat says that she's looking for the Birmingham connections as a Brummie. I'm not from Birmingham, but I'm from Coventry. However, I spent much of my teenage formative years in Birmingham, where my brother and sister still live. And it is an interesting question, you know, what is the relationship of the city to Stuart Hall's work? Because we know Catherine Hall's work engaged heavily with Birmingham, the Cadbury Empire, and also the Quaker movement. Now, Avtar was always a key link for me to Stuart Hall's work. Her book, Cartographers of a Diaspora, which has been, you know, influential all over the world. The book launch, I still have an image of it in my head, and I can still hear the sounds, smell the food in Birkbeck College with all these masters of mainly white old men on the walls, and Stuart Hall actually opening the book launch. And he said the words that he'd been waiting for this book for a long time. And she's one of those academics, probably like Stuart Hall, whereby they did lots of collective work. And when Avtar says, as she's just shared with us now, that it's not only the theory but the action, and I don't want to draw hard lines between the two. The theory is a form of action, we know, but a lot of her thinking, her politics has been forged together. And there's an interview that you can listen online where Avtar, and some of it's actually in this book, because what's interesting about this book is there's a series of interviews where the life of the kind of thinker comes alive in a different way to when we're just narrating, you know, endlessly for an audience. And in there she talks about how she came to England after she'd been in the States. She'd been, you know, studying there, and the politics of the global world actually kept her here. So that's a really interesting interview that you can listen to online. And Avtar's work, I came to it actually as an undergraduate student. I had one of those unusual degrees called a sandwich degree. So you went to work in industry. My industry was an Asian women's refuge in East London. And I spent a year there. I probably shouldn't have gone, I was too young, but I read about it in the Cosmopolitan magazine, believe it or not, this refuge. And my supervisor said, in those days they didn't have ethics committees and so forth. Maybe it was a good thing, actually. And I heard about this new refuge that was starting in Newham, and I went and worked for a year. And you know, I had a grant to work there as a student. But my dissertation came out of that as an undergraduate in the late 80s, and it was, is sisterhood possible? And naturally I was drawn towards the whole body of work that Avtar's work is central to, around black feminism. She mentioned OWAD and Feminist Review. She's been, you know, a co-founding member from the 70s, and she's still a member of Feminist Review. And there was a special issue in there called Number 17, when black feminists actually came in to autonomously edit it, because there'd been a lot of differences around racism, and some feminists left the collective at that point. Avtar was one of those who brought in people, and in there some very well-known essays on race and domestic violence, and how do we think of those intersectional natures. And in fact I came to the language of intersectionality, or I should say the practice of it. I didn't even know about Crenshaw's work. I read Angelo Davis, Race, Class and Gender. I read Avtar's work. I read, you know, Gail Lewis's essays, Mina Maddo's essays. So it seems to have got stuck, sometimes a legacy, the telling of intersectionality. With Crenshaw, she has done significant work. However, there's a sort of global roots, I would say, OUTES, to intersectionalities, how we bring those in. And yes, so then I think I realized just now as I was sitting there, I first met Avtar after my MA. She ran this really distinctive extramural studies course on race and racism at Birkbeck College. And I went along to become a tutor, a sessional tutor. So I think I worked 2 or 3 hours. I did the teaching in Birkbeck. And most of the students were mature students, because it was sort of after hours. I think our course started at 5 or 6 o'clock. And what was really interesting in terms of materiality of that intellectual undertaking as a form of curriculum was, we had a box of books. It was a long oblong suitcase, do you remember? And it would be delivered to the room you were teaching in. And it was the books that you taught alongside. And then you would be the librarian in the room for your students. And you'd give them out, and they'd give them back the following week. So it's a really different form of, I wouldn't call it DIY, but more informal but organised form of teaching. And Avtar led, you know, she oversaw a lot of the teaching on race, or all of it, I would say, in extramural studies. And so for me, it's not only what's on the page, which has been absolutely, you know, a life force for thinking about diaspora, crisscrossing intersectionalities, as she calls it, and how do we think of race, gender and class together, not just a list. Well, how does it live? Her work's been so critical for that. But also, I would have to say, it's the kind of teacher she is. And to me, she's been a very informal teacher all my life. It's a pedagogic practice. She's a star, but she doesn't do the prima donna thing, right? She doesn't do that, and we're constantly learning not only about concepts through her work, her theory, but how to be an academic. I'm still learning how to be an academic, and especially given all the traps that we have now, with, you know, everything from rankings to ref to all of that. And luckily she left before that really took on a force. But there are sort of lots of contradictions in the British, you know, establishment. And I remember Avtar's also inaugural lecture, you know, which you give when you've been appointed as a professor. And by this time she'd, you know, done so much work. She was known all over the world. They didn't make her a professor till really towards the end of her retirement life. That's when they made her a professor. So she has lived this sort of intersectionality in many ways. But see, she doesn't kind of, I don't think she ever dwells on it. I'll probably talk about that more than she does. And, but there are so many aspects about her way of thinking and concept making and practice that are not in her books. I came across a film that she made with a collective. She made it in 1990. Yes, it was called Arjgal. In fact, they made 2 films, but one film is released, which means today and yesterday in Punjabi, and it was made as a form of a community education. It was extramural studies course, wasn't it, Avtar? That she took to Southall, and she took it to, well, she didn't take it actually. It was much more organic than that. She was doing some work with adult education, open-ended work in a Asian elderly centre called Milap Day Centre, and she asked the men and the women there, what would you like to learn? Do you want to study anything? And they said, oh, these video recorders are in, you know, the big heavy one. We want to record our lives. So Avtar brought in actually a researcher, Jasbir Panisar, and a video filmmaker, community filmmaker, Vipin Kumar. And over 6 weeks, they taught, mainly it became a group of women, to make films about their lives. And some of these women had never gone to school, but they learned these techniques. They created new languages for, you know, cameras, lenses, editing, so how she forges education, I think, is really interesting for us. How her concepts live in different forms, in articles and, you know, the books that are critical for us, but also in the education she's facilitated in her life. And I did join Feminist Review as well, and the first essay Avtar asked me to write was, well, what's changed? You know, it's been 20 years since issue 17 of Feminist Review. What has changed? She genuinely asked me that question, and I was still saying, well, there's still problems going on in the academy. You know, the racism is still there, whiteness still lives there. There are lots of openings as well, which she wouldn't have had in her life that we have. But it's a kind of contentious domain. Still happening. So, and you were a bit surprised that we were still feeling that, and but it, you know, it's there. And she also, I would say, taught me how to put my rage into diplomatic writing. So, you know, it takes a few conversations and lots of coffee and dinner, and that's how the writing forged. And sometimes we forget that, because it's so cold, the process of writing. You send it off to a journal, you get some vicious reviews because someone's having to do it in their night shift, you know, these unpaid labour, and it's all anonymised. I think that's a bit of a problem. But Avtar does it in a kind of engaged, critical, but you know, warm generosity in her scholarship. So there's a lot I could say. I mean, one thing maybe we need to bear in mind, that she's been at the forefront of groups like Southall Black Sisters. She's a co-founding member of Southall Black Sisters, and many of you might know actually in Birmingham we have Birmingham Black Sisters as well, around domestic violence and immigration issues. And sometimes she overlooks all the creative work she does. Even though she's, you know, been a force in cultural studies, she's overlooked it. And only a few years ago, when you were working with the 40th anniversary of the Southall risings against, you know, the killing of Blair Peach, Avtar started telling me how at the early stage of South of Black Sisters, you put on loads of plays.
Yes, we did.
Lots of dramas, and then we found one article of a researcher from the States who had published it. You know, it just was sitting there on the side. But yeah, she doesn't kind of bring it out there, and I always laugh and say to her, if this was someone like Bruno Latour, he would have made a massive tomb of it that big by now. So yes, thank you. I just want to say thank you really to Avtar, and also to Angelo and the rest of you for bringing this forward and putting on this brilliant initiative so that we can carry on this living heritage, as Stuart Hall would say, of the legacies that have formed us, and we're continuously learning from. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nirmal and Avtar. I'm going to just say a few words. I was not going to stand up as you did as well. I felt the pressure now. Well, Nirmal was saying that how about links and how we get in contact with people's work, right? And I actually got in contact with Avtar's work through Nirmal, of course. So for me, it is a huge pleasure to be here. I'm really glad that you two accepted our invitation and you're here today, because they are both, very important for my intellectual development. So obviously Nirmal was my supervisor at Goldsmith College, so her work and her book, Space Invaders, it's very important for my own trajectory. And Avtar's work as well, Cartographies of Diaspora, obviously it's so important for so many of us here today. But speaking of decoloniality, connections, translations, I actually read Avtar's work in Brazil in 2006 because they translated a chapter of Cartographies of Diaspora. I didn't know it was one of the chapters in your book. I think it's chapter 7 on difference and diversity in a feminist journal in Brazil. And at the time, it's very interesting because you do talk about these debates in your recent book, and there was the debate going on in Brazil between the orthodox Marxists, saying that no, we need to look at class and so on. And then at the time, in Brazil, there were this group of people that obviously they were drawing on feminism and feminist studies, but they were saying, look, we need to look at difference, right? But it was very interesting because I was being taught by these professors that they were kind of competing internally in our department. And because of the history of Brazil, both in terms of the nation formation, right? We have no racial problems in Brazil. That was one of our main myth to form as a nation, right? So our problem is just economic problem, class issue. We live in a racial democracy. And so because of that race, people were very scared to talk about it, right? And even gender. But then what happened was, people that they were talking about difference, then they were not acknowledging class and capitalist relations as well. So then that was this kind of vacuum that Avtar's work say, look, we need to, that it is a critique as well to intersectionality in a way, like we need this global, first of all, the global aspect, as part of it, but also let's look at capitalism and class and economic relations as well as part of it. So then coming to the UK to live here first and then do my PhD, and then being supervised by Nirmal, I got in touch with the rest of Avtar's work, and it provided me with important analytical tools, to analyze the social world beyond binaries, beyond essentialisms, right? Seeing connections and contradictions, learn how to connect histories and how to contextualize and historicize process as well. But also, I think what was very important, it was to look at emotions, the psychological aspect, and the psyche as well, that you talk all the time. And this provided me with to then do my own research with Brazilians in London when I was trying to problematize these assumptions about ethnic community, looking at migrants as this homogenized group. And then I said, okay, look, yeah, Brazilians here, they're actually talking about conflicts. They're talking about difference. They don't want to be seen as migrants, neither as Brazilians often. Or no, then the same person that told me that doesn't want to be seen as Brazilian, then is claiming that, no, I am Brazilian in particular context, right? And it was Avtar's work actually that provided me with the tools to look at how colonial histories, like the histories of Brazil, histories of race, class, and gender in the formation of our nation, which takes us back to the presence of Europeans and enslaved Africans there. They traveled with Brazilians to the UK, and people are constantly negotiating these differences, right? So based on that, and so I think I'm going to start like asking you some questions already, Avtar, so then we can open later on. One question that I would like to ask you to talk a bit more is how to develop what you also mentioned in the book, decolonial solidarity, or based on your talk as well, kind of multicultural cosmopolitanism, right? Because as we know, okay, we need to problematize essentialized categories, look at difference, but then as we know, there's also that problem of then people looking at doing this kind of competition to see which category of oppression is more oppressive than the other, right? So how to create that in avoiding, so how to create this, what we call the decolonial solidarity, avoiding that type of competition, but also avoiding re-essentialisms, right? Because that's often another problem. We just invert the scale of value. What is bad is seen as good, and what is good is seen as bad, or we do what, a southern theory. This is the original one, and we need to throw away everything else. So that is one question. And then thinking of the migrant as well. So then, how do we problematize the category of migrant? Do we keep using migrants as citizens? Is it important, or even as a kind of a positive essentialization to work with it? And the second and last question is, because you mentioned as well, you say that often the naming of intersectionality comes before the work, right? Or sometimes the intersectional or intersected work is not really done, but the naming of it is always there.
Yeah.
So, and now talking about your new book, I wanted to ask you if you think that the same is happening with decoloniality now, right? If the naming of decoloniality is coming before the actual decolonizing work happening, because as we see in academia, I think like intersectionality, decoloniality now become this buzzword that everyone is using, and for academic promotion, to apply for jobs and everything. And yeah, so then do you think this is happening? Because often also the decolonizing or the curriculum or people talk about, okay, we need to add voices from the global south, right? We coming from the global south, we also know how Eurocentric and imperialistic our assumptions also are, right? There. So, for instance, in Brazil as well, within this debate, a lot of people were talking about racialized differences, but they were silenced. And people were talking about race, class, and gender, like Lélia Gonzalez and others, but they have been silenced as well by the mainstream social science in Brazil. So that would be the second question. Thank you.
Sorry, those are I mean, you've been giving the answers yourself.
Sorry.
So there isn't much for me to add. But I think that to produce decolonial futures means that we have to kind of first acknowledge the histories of colonialism and their impacts on our lives. In terms of the way they position us vis-a-vis one another. So it's not abstract, it's very much embodied. These outcomes are very much embodied, and they kind of position all of us here in the room, our colors, our bodies. Those things matter a lot. So decolonial futures have to acknowledge that, have to work with that, but then to have to actually disentangle them and then go beyond them. That's important, because we can't be held back by histories. Histories are only important if they can enable us to move forward. So the key thing is, how do we move forward back from those histories, acknowledge them. Then we have to kind of look to the future. And now here, we don't use the term socialism very much anymore. But I have a socialist background, and I still believe, whether we use that terminology, it doesn't really matter. But what we really mean is that we need equality in society. Equality on the basis of our economic basis, where we're positioned, what we talk about class, but also equality in terms of our racialized backgrounds, how we are seen in terms of our colors, equality in terms of our gendered backgrounds, men, women, and also in relation to sexuality, in which ways in which certain sexualized people are represented and thought of in particular kind of ways. So I think we use the history, we move forward, and we produce futures which can actually enhance our subjectivities, can enhance our ways of being in the world, and can make us see ourselves in a positive light and see others in a positive light. I think I'll stop there.
Do you want to say something about decoloniality, Nirmal? Because you do have a paper about the decoloniality.
Ooh, yes.
Yes, maybe you want to say a few words about that as well.
Yes. Yes, Avtar mentioned Santos's work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Gaminda edited a special issue, Gaminda Bamra, of Sociological Review a few years ago on sociology of the South. And for many years I started feeling quite uncomfortable with this. Sociology of the South, the epistemologies of the South. And I couldn't work it out, but I kept feeling like there was a deja vu moment. I thought these terms have been discussed for some time. There's a lot of reading in the library, around, as you say, the different forms of decoloniality. And I found that, because my work has looked at somatic norm and authority, I found that actually particular kind of figures from essentially Northern Europe, but European figures were getting the limelight, actually. They were becoming the spokespersons for sociology of the South. And this was problematic, it is problematic. Quite a lot of colleagues who work on the area, and they said, I've also had this moment when thinking, well, where's all the other histories of knowledge critique? And so yes, I think we always have to think about who becomes who takes up the platform, who becomes center staged in knowledge of the so-called South, or with decoloniality, who becomes a spokesperson. How do we keep that kind of heterodoxy alive, or pluriversity alive? Yes, as Avtar says from Sylvia Winter's work, the verb of the doing of the humanness. How does that also articulate in our academic circuits of knowledge production? Is that what you wanted me to say?
Yes, thank you. Right, so thank you very much again, Avtar and Nirmal, for coming here. Thank you all for coming here, and I hope to see you in the next event.